That evening at home, Ashley found her mother sorting through a pile of letters. "More schools asking about our policies," she explained. "The superintendent's presenting our results at the National Education Conference next month." Ashley picked up one of the letters, reading it slowly. "Did you ever think all this would happen because of one broken phone?" Her mother looked up, smiling. "Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments of injustice. But it's not about what breaks, it's about how we choose to fix it." Tommy, now fully recovered from his asthma issues, bounded into the kitchen with his homework. "Hey, guess what? My teacher used your story in class today. We were learning about standing up for what's right." Ashley helped him with his math problems, thinking about how much had changed. The broken phone that had seemed like such a disaster had become a symbol of something much more important. The power of speaking up, of working together, of turning anger into action. Later that night, as she finished her homework, Ashley's new phone buzzed with a message. It was from Rachel. "Check out the school website. They've posted the final draft of the new Student Rights Handbook. We really did it." Ashley clicked the link, scrolling through the comprehensive document that she and her fellow council members had helped create. Every word represented hours of discussion, debate, and compromise. Every policy had been carefully crafted to ensure fairness and respect for all students. Looking at her reflection in the computer screen, Ashley hardly recognized the quiet girl who had once sat silently in Mrs. Peterson's class. That day had changed her, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Instead of making her bitter or angry, it had shown her the power of constructive change. "Mom," she called out, "remember how you said sometimes you have to break something to fix a broken system?" Her mother appeared in the doorway. "Yes." "I think we did more than fix it. We built something better." Her mother came over and hugged her tight. "You know what the best part is? This is just the beginning. Every student who walks through those school doors from now on will know they have a voice. They'll know they matter." As Ashley got ready for bed that night, she thought about all the changes that had happened in 6 months. A broken phone had started it all, but the real story wasn't about destruction, it was about construction. Building better policies, building stronger communities, building bridges between students and teachers, parents and administrators. The next morning, as she walked into Roosevelt High, Ashley passed the display case with her old phone. Next to it hung a new plaque that read, "Sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest changes. Speak up, stand together, make a difference." And that's exactly what they had done. 6 months later, the hallways of Roosevelt High looked different. Not because of any physical changes. The same old lockers lined the walls, and the same fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The difference was in the atmosphere, in the way students carried themselves, in the new sense of confidence that filled the air. Ashley walked through those hallways, now serving as the Student Council President and co-chair of the newly formed Student Parent Advisory Council. Her broken phone, carefully preserved in its Ziploc bag, sat in a display case near the main office, a reminder of how change often starts with a single moment. "Can you believe it's been half a year?" Jenny asked, falling into step beside her. They were headed to the monthly advisory council meeting, where students, parents, and teachers would discuss the progress of the new policies. The school's transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been resistance at first, teachers worried about losing authority, administrators concerned about setting precedents. But slowly, steadily, the changes had taken root. Mrs. Peterson had officially resigned 2 weeks after the board meeting, choosing to retire rather than face a formal review. But her departure was just the beginning of the real changes. In the main conference room, Ashley took a seat at the large oval table. Around her sat a diverse group: teachers, parents, students, administrators, all equal voices in shaping the school's future. Principal Thompson, who had once seemed so intimidated by confrontation, now actively sought out different perspectives. "Let's start with the numbers," he began, distributing handouts to everyone. "Since implementing our new communication policy, we've had 0 incidents of phone confiscation. The emergency phone system in each classroom has been used appropriately 12 times for genuine family emergencies." Ashley's mother, still serving as the council's legal advisor, nodded approvingly. "And the new disciplinary review system?" A teacher raised her hand, holding up a report. "We've seen a 70% decrease in disciplinary actions overall. More importantly, When we do have incidents, they're being handled through the peer mediation program first. It's working better than anyone expected. The meeting continued, with different members sharing updates and suggestions. The school's new policies had caught the attention of other districts. 5 other schools in the state had already adopted similar reforms. But the biggest changes weren't in the policies or procedures. They were in the small moments that happened every day. Like yesterday, when a freshman's grandfather had a heart attack during school hours. Instead of hiding her phone or worrying about getting in trouble, she'd simply shown her teacher the emergency text. The teacher had immediately walked her to the office, where she could use the emergency phone line to talk with the family. Or last week, when a student felt unfairly graded on an assignment. Instead of staying silent, they'd brought it to the attention of the new student advocacy office. The situation was reviewed fairly, the grade adjusted, and most importantly, no one felt powerless or afraid to speak up. After the meeting, Ashley headed to her AP history class, now taught by Mr. Lee, a young teacher who made history come alive through interactive discussions and diverse perspectives. Today's lesson was about social movements and change. "Who can tell me what makes a movement successful?" Mr. Lee asked the class. Several hands shot up, something that wouldn't have happened 6 months ago. Students now felt confident sharing their thoughts, knowing they would be heard and respected. "It's not just about pointing out what's wrong," Ashley found herself saying. "It's about bringing people together to make things right." Mr. Lee smiled. "Exactly. And sometimes the most powerful movements start with the smallest moments." After school, Ashley joined the peer mentoring program she'd helped establish. Younger students could now come talk about any concerns or problems they were facing. Today, a quiet freshman girl sat down, twisting her hands nervously. "I heard you were the one," she said softly. "The one who changed everything with the phone incident." Ashley shook her head. "I didn't change everything. We all did. Everyone who spoke up, who shared their stories, who wasn't afraid to say things could be better." The girl smiled, visibly relaxing. "Well, thanks to you guys, I'm not afraid to be here. My old school, things were different there." "Finally," he said, his voice softening slightly, "we want to formally apologize to Ashley and her family and to every student who has ever felt unfairly treated in our schools. We can and will do better." The room burst into applause again, but Superintendent Chen held up his hand. "There's one more thing. Mrs. Wright has brought to our attention the need for clear emergency communication protocols. Starting next week, every classroom will have a designated phone for emergency calls, and students with documented medical situations in their families will be given special consideration regarding phone access." Ashley felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened. Her mother squeezed her hand tightly. The meeting continued late into the night as the board worked out implementation details for each new policy. Students and parents offered suggestions, teachers shared their perspectives, and slowly, a new framework began to take shape. As people finally started heading home around midnight, Ashley overheard snippets of conversation that filled her with hope. Finally, someone listened. "This is just the beginning. Real change is happening." In the parking lot, her mother stopped to talk with other parents, while Ashley stood with her friends, all of them a bit overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "You did it," Jenny said, hugging her tightly. But Ashley shook her head. "We did it. All of us. Every person who spoke up, who shared their story, who wasn't afraid to say something needed to change." Looking back at the building where so much had just changed, Ashley thought about her broken phone, still sitting on her desk at home. What had started as a moment of anger and injustice had transformed into something powerful, a catalyst for real, meaningful change. Her mother joined them, keys jingling in her hand. "Ready to go home? Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. The Student Parent Advisory Council needs to start working on those new policies." As they drove home under the stars, Ashley realized that sometimes the biggest victories don't look like what you'd expect. Sometimes they look like a room full of people working together to make things better, like a community finding its voice, like a system finally ready to change. And sometimes, just sometimes, they look like a broken phone that helped fix a broken system. The emergency school board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but by 5:30, the parking lot was already full. Parents, students, teachers, and community members filled every available space in the district's main office building. The usual monthly board meetings rarely drew more than a dozen attendees. Tonight, hundreds had shown up. Inside the boardroom, officials rushed to set up extra chairs and a video feed for the overflow crowd in the hallway. Board members sat at their elevated desk, shuffling through thick stacks of documents and speaking in hushed tones. The tension in the room was almost visible. Ashley and her mother arrived early, taking seats in the front row. Behind them, students from Roosevelt High filled several rows, many wearing blue ribbons, the school's color, as a sign of solidarity. Jenny sat on Ashley's right, while Rachel and other classmates clustered nearby, all carrying folders of evidence they'd helped collect. "Remember," Ashley's mother whispered, straightening her blazer, "no matter what happens tonight, you've already created change just by speaking up." At exactly 7 p.m., Superintendent Chen called the meeting to order. The usual agenda items were suspended for what he called an urgent matter requiring immediate attention. The room fell silent as he began speaking. Over the past week, our district has faced unprecedented scrutiny following an incident at Roosevelt High School, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. Tonight, we're here to address not just that single incident, but the broader issues it has brought to light. The superintendent clicked a remote, and a large screen behind him lit up with statistics, emails, and testimonials they'd gathered. Our investigation has revealed a pattern of conduct that cannot be ignored. For the next hour, board members presented their findings. They showed clips from security cameras, displayed graphs of disciplinary actions broken down by student demographics, and read excerpts from formal complaints that had previously been overlooked. Then came the public comment period. One by one, students stepped up to the microphone to share their experiences. A senior described how Mrs. Peterson had dismissed her cultural history presentation as too ethnic for AP history. Another student spoke about being told to tone down his enthusiasm because it was disruptive, though other students displaying similar excitement were never reprimanded. Teachers spoke too. A young English teacher revealed how she tried to report concerns about Mrs. Peterson's behavior but was told to focus on her own classroom. A veteran science teacher admitted he'd seen problems but had been afraid to speak up, fearing professional retaliation. As each person spoke, board members took notes, asked questions, and listened intently. This wasn't the usual bureaucratic meeting. This was a community demanding real change. Finally, it was Ashley's turn to speak. She walked to the microphone, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I never wanted to be at the center of all this," she began. "That day in class, I was just trying to check on my little brother in the hospital. But what happened next showed me something important. Sometimes a broken phone can fix a broken system." She paused, looking around the room at all the faces watching her. "This isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about making sure every student feels safe and respected at school. It's about creating rules that protect us while treating us with dignity." The room erupted in applause when she finished. Even some board members were nodding in agreement. Superintendent Chen took the podium again, his expression serious. "Based on our investigation and the testimony we've heard tonight, the board has reached several decisions." The room grew quiet as he read from an official document. First, Mrs. Peterson has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full review of her teaching license by the State Board of Education. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but he continued. "Second, we are implementing a complete overhaul of our disciplinary policies, with input from students, parents, and teachers. This will include clear guidelines on handling personal property and emergency communications during school hours." He looked up from his paper, making eye contact with various members of the audience. "Third, we're establishing a student-parent advisory council that will meet monthly to address concerns about fairness and equality in our schools. This council will have direct access to administration and the school board. Fourth, all staff will undergo mandatory training on cultural sensitivity, implicit bias, and appropriate disciplinary measures. This training will be ongoing, not just a one-time session." Social media exploded with clips from the press conference. Education blogs picked up the story, analyzing the broader implications for school policy reform. Even national education organizations began issuing statements about the need for comprehensive review of disciplinary procedures. As the school day drew to a close, Ashley gathered her books, trying to avoid the cameras still stationed outside. A young reporter managed to catch up with her near the parking lot. "Ashley, can you tell us how it feels to be at the center of this national conversation?" The reporter called out, microphone extended. Before Ashley could respond, her mother appeared beside her, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "My daughter is still a student first," she told the reporter firmly. "She's here to learn, just like every other student, and that's exactly why we're pushing for change, so all students can focus on their education without fear of unfair treatment." In the car ride home, Ashley scrolled through her friend's phone, reading the hundreds of messages and comments flooding social media. Students from schools across the country were sharing the video, adding their own stories of classroom inequity and calling for reform. "I never thought it would get this big," Ashley said quietly, looking out at the news vans still following their car. Her mother glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Sometimes it takes one clear example of injustice to help people see the bigger picture. What happened to you was wrong, but look at all the good that's coming from it. People are finally paying attention to issues that have been ignored for too long. That evening, as Ashley worked on her homework, the television in the living room continued to broadcast updates about the story. Educational experts discussed the need for reform, former students shared their experiences, and school districts across the country began announcing reviews of their disciplinary policies. The broken phone that started it all sat on Ashley's desk, a reminder of how one moment of injustice could spark a movement for change. Tomorrow would bring more cameras, more questions, and more attention, but Ashley felt ready. This wasn't just her story anymore. It belonged to every student who'd ever felt powerless in a classroom, every parent who'd worried about their child's treatment at school, and every educator who believed in creating a fairer system. As she got ready for bed, Ashley received one last text from Jenny. "Check out tomorrow's newspaper headline. Local incident sparks national dialogue on educational reform. You're making history, girl." Ashley smiled, thinking about all the changes that were already beginning to take shape. The media storm might have been unexpected, but it was shining a light on issues that had been in the shadows for far too long. Sometimes, she realized, it takes a storm to clear the air and make way for something better. The morning news van parked outside Roosevelt High was just the beginning. By noon, the school's usually quiet street had transformed into a maze of news vehicles, reporters with microphones, and curious onlookers. The video of Mrs. Peterson smashing Ashley's phone had gone viral overnight, catching fire across social media platforms and landing on major news websites. "Local teacher's classroom outburst sparks debate about school discipline," read the headline on Channel 4 News. The footage played on repeat on local stations, each showing the moment when authority crossed the line into destruction. Inside the school, Ashley tried to keep her head down and focus on her studies, but it wasn't easy. Every time she walked past a window, camera flashes went off. Students she'd never spoken to before stopped her in the hallways, wanting to share their own stories or simply offer support. "You won't believe this," Jenny said, rushing up to Ashley between classes. She held up her phone, showing a national news website. "They're calling it the phone incident that changed a school system. Your story is trending nationwide." Ashley's mother had anticipated the media attention. That morning, she'd given Ashley careful instructions. "Don't talk to any reporters without me present. This isn't about getting attention, it's about making real change." But the story had taken on a life of its own. Educational experts appeared on morning shows, discussing the broader implications of classroom discipline policies. Social media buzzed with debates about teachers' authority limits and students' rights. The hashtag Roosevelt Reform had evolved into hashtag Classroom Justice, with students across the country sharing their own experiences of unfair treatment. During lunch, Ashley sat with her usual group of friends, trying to maintain some normalcy. The cafeteria television, usually ignored by students, was tuned to a local news channel where a panel of educators discussed the incident. "What we're seeing here goes beyond one teacher's actions," a distinguished-looking education professor was saying. "This incident has opened up a crucial conversation about how we handle discipline in our schools, especially when it comes to treating all students fairly and equally." The camera cut to footage of students leaving Roosevelt High with a reporter's voiceover. Sources say this isn't the first time concerns have been raised about this teacher's behavior. Former students have come forward with their own stories, painting a picture of a systemic issue that may have gone unchecked for years. "Turn it off," Ashley said quietly, but she couldn't help noticing how many phones in the cafeteria were recording the broadcast, how many students were sharing and commenting on social media. In the teacher's lounge, the atmosphere was tense. Some teachers defended Mrs. Peterson, citing the challenges of maintaining discipline in modern classrooms. Others spoke in hushed tones about times they'd witnessed concerning behavior but hadn't known how to address it. Mr. Thompson, the principal, hadn't left his office all day. The phone rang constantly with calls from concerned parents, education officials, and media outlets seeking comments. His secretary had stopped answering, letting everything go to voicemail. By afternoon, local community leaders had organized a peaceful gathering outside the school. Parents, students, and advocates held signs promoting educational equality and fair treatment. News cameras captured it all, broadcasting images of the diverse crowd united in their call for change. Ashley's mother arrived at the school for a scheduled press conference. She'd chosen her words carefully, focusing on solutions rather than blame. Standing at the podium set up on the school steps, she addressed the crowd of reporters and cameras. "This isn't just about one broken phone or one teacher's actions," she began, her voice steady and clear. "This is about ensuring that every student, regardless of their background, receives fair and equal treatment in our educational system." The overwhelming response to this incident shows that these concerns resonate with communities across our nation. The cameras flashed as she continued. "We've received hundreds of messages from students, parents, and educators sharing similar experiences. This tells us that we need to look beyond individual incidents and examine the systems that allow such behavior to persist." Inside the school library, Ashley watched the press conference on a student's laptop with a small group of friends. Her mother looked confident and professional, handling reporters' questions with grace while keeping the focus on positive change. "Your mom is amazing," Rachel whispered, squeezing Ashley's hand. "She's turning this whole thing into something bigger than any of us imagined." As the day went on, more people came forward with their stories. A former office assistant revealed how Mrs. Peterson would mark certain students tardy even when they arrived on time. His substitute teacher described witnessing her make inappropriate comments about students' cultural backgrounds. By afternoon, the superintendent's office had received so many calls and emails that they had to bring in extra staff to handle them all. Local parent groups were organizing, demanding a complete review of all disciplinary policies. Ashley's mother spent hours in meetings, presenting evidence and arguing for systemic changes. She showed them statistics, testimonials, and video evidence, but her most powerful argument was about the future. "Today it was my daughter's phone," she told the board. "But what about tomorrow? What message are we sending to our children when we allow this kind of behavior to continue? Every student who walks through those school doors deserves to feel safe, respected, and valued." The sun was setting when Ashley's mother finally returned home. She found Ashley and Tommy sitting at the kitchen table, working on homework together. The sight made her smile. Even after everything, her children were still focused on their education. "How did it go?" Ashley asked, looking up from her textbook. Her mother set down her briefcase and joined them at the table. "They've seen the evidence. All of it. Now we wait for their decision." She reached over and squeezed Ashley's hand. "But something tells me this is going to lead to bigger changes than anyone expected." That night, as Ashley got ready for bed, she thought about everything that had happened. Her broken phone still sat on her desk, but it didn't seem as important anymore. What started as a moment of injustice had grown into something much more significant, a movement for real change. Her mother's words from earlier echoed in her mind. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. It's not about what was broken, it's about what we build in its place. Tomorrow would bring the board's decision, but regardless of what they decided, Ashley knew things would never be quite the same at Roosevelt High. The truth had come out, and with it came the opportunity for real change, not just for her, but for every student who would walk those halls in the years to come. The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Ashley's mother walked into the school district's main office, carrying a thick folder under her arm. The security guard at the front desk looked up, surprised to see anyone so early. It was barely 7 a.m., but Mrs. Wright had a plan, and timing was everything. "I'm here to file a formal complaint and request for investigation," she announced, placing her briefcase on the counter. "And I'll need to speak with Superintendent Chen immediately." The guard started to say something about scheduling appointments, but Mrs. Wright simply handed him her business card. His eyes widened slightly as he read her credentials. Within minutes, she was being escorted to the superintendent's office. Back at Roosevelt High, Ashley walked through the hallways that felt different now. Students stopped to give her supportive nods, and even teachers seemed to look at her with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Mrs. Peterson's classroom was empty. She hadn't shown up for school that day. The school board called an emergency meeting, Jenny whispered during lunch. "My mom works in the district office, and she says they're reviewing the security footage right now." The cafeteria buzzed with excitement. Students gathered around tables, sharing updates they'd heard. Someone had started a social media hashtag that was gaining traction, #RooseveltReform. Parents were calling the school board nonstop, demanding answers about their children's safety and fair treatment. Meanwhile, in the superintendent's office, Ashley's mother was presenting her case. The room was packed with board members, all watching intently as security footage played on the large screen. "As you can see," Mrs. Wright pointed out, "the destruction of my daughter's property was not an isolated incident." She clicked through a series of video clips showing Mrs. Peterson's different interactions with students over the past month. The cameras don't lie. Superintendent Chen leaned forward in his chair, his forehead creased with concern. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Wright. But I want you to know we're taking this very seriously." "With all due respect," Mrs. Wright replied, opening her folder, "taking it seriously isn't enough. I have documented evidence of at least 50 incidents where Mrs. Peterson showed clear bias in her treatment of students, and that's just from the past 2 years." She spread photographs, graded papers, and printed email complaints across the conference table. "Look at these grade distributions. Look at the pattern of who gets sent out of class, who gets their property confiscated, who gets recommended for easier classes despite their academic performance." The board members passed the documents around, their expressions growing more troubled with each piece of evidence. One woman, who had been quietly taking notes, finally spoke up. "Mrs. Wright, what exactly are you seeking here?" Ashley's mother stood straight, her voice clear and determined. "I'm not here to destroy anyone's career or demand monetary compensation. I'm here because our children deserve better. They deserve a safe learning environment where they're judged by their work, not their appearance or background." She pulled out another folder, this one containing student testimonials. "These are statements from current and former students. They're willing to speak on record about their experiences. But more importantly, they have suggestions for how to make things better." Back at school, Ashley sat in study hall, trying to focus on her homework but constantly checking her friend's phone for updates. The whole school seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "Did you hear?" Rachel rushed in, almost forgetting to whisper. "They're reviewing all of Mrs. Peterson's evaluations from the past 5 years, and they found something big." It turned out that other teachers had reported concerns about Mrs. Peterson's behavior before, but the complaints had been buried under administrative paperwork. One young teacher had even resigned after trying to speak up about what she'd witnessed in Mrs. Peterson's classroom. The investigation was spreading beyond just one teacher now. Questions were being raised about the whole system. How had these complaints been overlooked for so long? Who was responsible for following up on reported incidents? What policies needed to change to prevent this from happening again? The policy isn't just strict, Ashley realized, it's dangerous. And the way it's enforced. She trailed off, looking at the mountain of evidence they'd collected. Her mother pulled out her phone, checking the time. "It's late, and you all have school tomorrow. But I want you to know, each of you, that what you're doing here is important. You're not just helping Ashley, you're standing up for every student who comes after you." As the students packed up their evidence, carefully organizing everything into folders and drives, there was a sense of purpose in the air. They weren't just angry teenagers anymore. They were advocates for change. After everyone left, Ashley helped her mother clean up the kitchen. The table was clearer now, but the weight of everything they'd discovered hung heavy in the air. "Mom," Ashley said, stacking the last of the papers, "what happens now?" Her mother looked up from her notes, a determined glint in her eye. Now we make sure this never happens to another student again. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to the school board. Not just as your mother or as a lawyer, but as someone who believes in making things right. She pulled Ashley into a tight hug. Sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with anger or revenge, but with truth and justice. We've got the truth, now we just need to make sure justice is served. As Ashley lay in bed that night, she could hear her mother still working downstairs, the soft tapping of keyboard keys mixing with the occasional rustle of papers. The broken pieces of her phone sat on her bedside table, a reminder of how one moment of injustice had sparked a movement for change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since the incident, Ashley felt truly hopeful. They had evidence, they had support, and most importantly, they had the truth on their side. Mrs. Peterson might have broken her phone, but in doing so, she'd unleashed something far more powerful, the collective voice of students who were finally ready to be heard. The kitchen table at the Wright household had transformed into a makeshift command center. Papers were spread across its surface, illuminated by the warm glow of the evening light filtering through the curtains. Ashley's mother sat at the head of the table, her laptop open, reading glasses perched on her nose as she scrolled through what seemed like endless emails. "That's the 107th story," she murmured, rubbing her temples. The emails had started pouring in just hours after she handed out her business cards at school. Each one told a different tale about Mrs. Peterson, but they all shared a common thread of unfairness and bias. Ashley sat beside her mother, highlighting important dates and names in a notebook. Her little brother Tommy was curled up on the living room couch nearby, his breathing finally stable after the hospital stay. The sound of his peaceful sleep was a reminder of why everything had started in the first place. "Look at this one," her mother said, turning the laptop screen. "A student from 3 years ago. She says Mrs. Peterson made her sit in the back of the class because her natural hair was too distracting for other students. She took off her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose. How does someone like this stay in the education system for so long?" The doorbell rang, interrupting their work. Ashley opened it to find Jenny and Rachel standing there, along with several other students from school. They carried folders and USB drives. "We brought more evidence," Jenny announced, holding up her folder. "My sister's friend's older brother graduated 2 years ago, and he kept all his graded papers from Mrs. Peterson's class. Wait until you see the difference in how she graded different students." The kitchen table grew more crowded as the students spread out their materials. Rachel pulled up a spreadsheet she'd made, comparing test scores and grades across different groups of students over the past year. "I'm good with numbers," she explained quietly, "and these numbers tell a story that's hard to ignore." Ashley's mother examined the spreadsheet, her eyes narrowing. "This is excellent work, Rachel. This kind of statistical analysis is exactly what we need." The group worked together as the evening wore on. Parents started calling in too, offering their own stories about interactions with Mrs. Peterson at parent-teacher conferences. One mother described how Mrs. Peterson had suggested her daughter might be more comfortable in regular history rather than AP, despite the girls' straight A's in all other subjects. Around midnight, as Ashley was sorting through another pile of graded papers, she found something that made her pause. "Mom, look at this," she called out, spreading several essays on the table. "These 2 papers have almost identical answers, but the grades are completely different. And look at the comments." Her mother leaned in, comparing the papers. Where one student had been praised for showing initiative in their interpretation, another had been criticized for straying from established historical facts, despite making the same arguments. "The pattern is clear," her mother said, standing up to pace the kitchen. "But we need more than just academic evidence. This isn't just about grades anymore." She turned to the group of students still working diligently at her table. "We need to show how this affected you. All of you. Not just academically, but personally." Rachel raised her hand hesitantly. "I still have the voice recording from when she made me explain about my headscarf," she offered. "I recorded it on my phone because I knew something wasn't right about how she was treating me. And I have the emails from when I tried to complain about her last year," Jenny added. "The administration just kept saying they'd look into it." Ashley's mother nodded, a plan forming in her mind. "This is bigger than one broken phone," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "This is about creating real change in how schools handle these situations." She grabbed a fresh legal pad and began writing. "First, we need the security footage from today. The school has cameras in all hallways and classrooms. It's district policy. Then, we'll need copies of all official complaints filed against Mrs. Peterson, even if they were dismissed." Tommy coughed in his sleep, making everyone turn. Ashley's mother's expression softened as she looked at her son. "And we need to address the phone policy itself. What if my son's asthma attack had been even more severe? What if Ashley couldn't reach me because her phone was destroyed?" The students exchanged glances, remembering their own stories of times they'd needed to contact family during school hours. As her mother approached, Ashley noticed how the other students straightened up, phones ready. They knew this moment was important. This wasn't just about a broken phone anymore. It was about every student who'd ever felt powerless in Mrs. Peterson's classroom. "Mom," Ashley started, but her mother held up a hand, her eyes fixed on Mr. Thompson. "Principal Thompson, I presume." Her voice was professional, but carried an edge that made everyone listen. "I'd like to see the school's policy on handling student property. And while you're getting that, you can also pull up Mrs. Peterson's disciplinary record. I'm particularly interested in any previous incidents involving student complaints." Mr. Thompson's face paled slightly. "Mrs. Wright, perhaps we should discuss this in my office." We will," Ashley's mother agreed. "But first, I'd like every student here who has ever witnessed Mrs. Peterson displaying inappropriate behavior to email their experiences to my office." She pulled out her business cards, the ones with her law firm's logo, and handed them to the nearest students. "My email is on there. Include dates, times, and any evidence you might have." The hallway erupted with activity as students passed around the business cards, copying down the email address. Ashley watched in amazement as her mother took control of the situation, transforming a personal injury into a catalyst for change. "And one more thing," her mother added, addressing the crowd of students. "Thank you all for supporting my daughter. Sometimes it takes a whole community standing together to make things right." As they walked toward the principal's office, Ashley felt different from the girl who'd walked into school that morning. The weight of the broken phone in her bag reminded her of what had been lost, but looking at the determined faces of her classmates and the confident stride of her mother, she realized something far more important had been gained. Mrs. Peterson had tried to teach them about the Industrial Revolution today, about how one small invention could change the world. But she'd accidentally taught them an even more valuable lesson, that sometimes it takes one moment of injustice to unite people and spark real change. As the office door closed behind them, Ashley caught a glimpse of students already typing out their stories on their phones, speaking in hushed but determined voices about finally being heard. The afternoon sun streamed through the hallway windows, and in its light, Ashley could see that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a broken phone. The final bell of the day rang through Roosevelt High's hallways, but for Ashley, time seemed to stand still. Her hands trembled as she gathered the pieces of her shattered phone, carefully placing them in a Ziploc bag she'd gotten from the cafeteria. Each broken piece felt like a reminder of the humiliation she'd endured just hours ago. As she walked out of Mrs. Peterson's classroom, a group of students waited for her outside. Jenny, her lab partner from chemistry class, immediately wrapped her in a tight hug. "I can't believe she did that," Jenny whispered. "My sister's in her class last period, and the whole school's already talking about it." The hallway buzzed with activity as students gathered around Ashley, showing her the videos they'd captured. Some had perfect angles of Mrs. Peterson's outburst, while others had caught the aftermath. In less than 3 hours, the incident had spread through the school like wildfire. "You should see what people are saying online," said David, a quiet boy who sat behind Ashley in history. He held up his phone, showing her the school's unofficial Facebook group. The comments section was exploding with similar stories about Mrs. Peterson's behavior. One student wrote about how Mrs. Peterson had made his cousin cry last semester for speaking Spanish during group work. Another shared how she'd torn up a student's drawing because it wasn't history-related enough. Pattern after pattern emerged of selective enforcement and harsh treatment, particularly towards certain students. Ashley felt a mix of emotions washing over her. The support from her classmates was overwhelming, but her mind kept drifting to her brother. Without her phone, she had no way of knowing how he was doing. The worry must have shown on her face because Jenny immediately offered her phone. "Call your mom," she insisted. "Use my phone." With shaking fingers, Ashley dialed her mother's number. Each ring felt like an eternity until finally, her mom's voice came through. "Jenny, is everything okay?" "Mom, it's me." Ashley's voice cracked. "I'm using Jenny's phone because something happened." There was a pause on the other end. "Ashley? Baby, what's wrong? Are you okay?" The concern in her mother's voice made Ashley's eyes well up with tears. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure in the crowded hallway. "How's Tommy? Is he all right?" "He's stable now. The doctors got his breathing under control, but they want to keep him overnight for observation. Now tell me what happened to your phone." Ashley looked around at the supportive faces of her classmates, drawing strength from their presence. "Mrs. Peterson, she took my phone when I was checking your message about Tommy, but she didn't just take it, Mom. She smashed it. Right there on my desk, in front of everyone." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When her mother spoke again, her voice was eerily calm. "She did what?" As Ashley explained the full story, more students gathered around, adding details about what they'd witnessed. Someone mentioned they'd already uploaded the video to YouTube. Another student talked about starting a petition to have Mrs. Peterson investigated. "Mom, I tried to tell her about Tommy, but she wouldn't listen. She just..." "I'm on my way," her mother cut in, her voice firm with barely controlled anger. "Stay right there. Don't talk to any teachers or administrators until I arrive. And tell your friends to save those videos." While waiting for her mother, more students approached Ashley with their own stories. A girl named Rachel showed Ashley a diary entry from last year, documenting how Mrs. Peterson had made her stand in front of the class and explain herself for wearing a headscarf during Ramadan. Two sophomore brothers described how she consistently graded their papers more harshly than other students, despite having identical answers. "It's like she's got something against anyone who's different," Rachel explained, her voice quiet but firm. "We all saw it, but nobody knew what to do about it." The crowd parted as Mr. Thompson, the school principal, hurried down the hallway. His usual confident stride was replaced by a nervous shuffle as he approached Ashley. "Miss, I've been informed about an incident in Mrs. Peterson's class. If you could come to my office. My daughter won't be going anywhere without me present." The strong voice cut through the hallway chatter. Ashley's mother stood at the entrance, still wearing her hospital visitor's badge, her business suit slightly wrinkled from the long day. Despite her disheveled appearance, she carried herself with an authority that made even Mr. Thompson take a step back. Mrs. Peterson stood there, seemingly shocked by her own actions. The hand that had smashed the phone trembled slightly. For a moment, the mask of authority slipped, revealing a flicker of uncertainty. But instead of apologizing, she straightened her blazer and cleared her throat. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," she announced to the class, her voice slightly shaky but attempting to maintain authority. "This is what happens when you don't follow the rules." Ashley felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. The mixture of shock, anger, and worry for her brother created a storm of emotions she could barely contain. Her hands clenched into fists under her desk as she stared at the remains of her phone. Other students in the class began to stir. Some pulled out their own phones, continuing to record. Others whispered among themselves, their voices a rising tide of discontent. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from the usual academic tedium to something electric and dangerous. "But that's destruction of property," someone called out from the back of the room. "Yeah, you can't just break people's stuff." Another voice joined in. Mrs. Peterson's face reddened. "Quiet, all of you," she snapped. "Or would anyone else like to have their phone confiscated?" The threat hung in the air, but it didn't have its usual effect. Instead of cowering, students began pulling out their phones more openly, documenting everything. The power dynamic in the room had shifted irreversibly. Ashley finally found her voice. It came out steady and clear, surprising even herself. "My brother is in the emergency room having an asthma attack," she said, looking directly at Mrs. Peterson. "That phone was my only way to know if he's okay." The color drained from Mrs. Peterson's face as the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The bell rang, its harsh sound breaking the tension in the room. As students began gathering their things, many stopped by Ashley's desk, offering words of support and showing her the videos they'd recorded. The incident had already begun spreading through text messages and social media. By the time Ashley picked up the pieces of her shattered phone, she knew this wasn't over. Walking out of the classroom, Ashley felt different. The shy, rule-following student who'd walked in that morning was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who knew that sometimes rules needed to be challenged, especially when they were enforced without compassion or reason. Little did Mrs. Peterson know, but in her moment of unchecked anger, she hadn't just destroyed a phone, she'd sparked something much bigger. And tomorrow would prove just how costly that moment of rage would become. The morning sun streamed through the windows of room 203 at Roosevelt High School, casting long shadows across rows of wooden desks. It was just another Tuesday in October, or at least that's how it seemed when Ashley took her usual seat in the third row of Mrs. Peterson's AP History class. The air felt heavy with the usual mix of teenage boredom and the faint smell of dry erase markers. Ashley wasn't like most of the other students who dozed off during historical lectures. She actually loved history, especially when it came to civil rights movements and social change. Her mom always said knowledge of the past was the key to building a better future. That's why she'd worked so hard to get into AP History, even though some counselors had tried to discourage her from taking such a challenging course. The class started like any other day. Mrs. Peterson, a tall woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, wrote the day's topic on the whiteboard: the impact of Industrial Revolution on modern society. Her handwriting was as rigid as her personality, all straight lines and sharp angles. Everyone knew about Mrs. Peterson's strict classroom rules, especially her absolute hatred for phones in class. She'd lecture about it at least once a week, saying how kids these days were too attached to their screens. Ashley usually kept her phone tucked away in her backpack, switched to silent mode. But today was different. Her 10-year-old brother had been having trouble breathing that morning. Their mom had taken him to the hospital, promising to text updates about his condition. As the only big sister, Ashley couldn't help but worry. She placed her phone in her lap, hidden under her desk, checking it occasionally for any news. The first hour of class passed without incident. Mrs. Peterson droned on about steam engines and factory conditions, her voice a monotonous hum in the background. Ashley took detailed notes while discreetly glancing at her phone screen every few minutes. No messages yet. The worry in her stomach grew with each passing minute. Then, just as Mrs. Peterson was explaining the significance of the cotton gin, Ashley's phone lit up. The message was from her mom, at emergency room. Doctors say it's a severe asthma attack. They're giving him treatment now. Ashley's heart jumped to her throat. She needed to know if her little brother was okay. Trying to be as subtle as possible, she picked up her phone to type a quick response. That's when everything went wrong. Mrs. Peterson's sharp eyes caught the faint glow of the screen. Her lecture stopped mid-sentence. The clicking of her heels against the linoleum floor echoed through the suddenly silent classroom as she marched toward Ashley's desk. Well, Mrs. Peterson's voice tripped with sarcasm. I see we have more important things to do than learn about history. She stood over Ashley's desk, casting a shadow that felt like a dark cloud. Hand it over. Ashley looked up, her heart racing. Mrs. Peterson, please, I'm sorry. It's just that my brother. I don't want to hear excuses. Mrs. Peterson cut her off, extending her hand. You know the rules. No phones in class. Period. The other students watched in uncomfortable silence. Some shifted in their seats. Others looked down at their desks. They'd seen Mrs. Peterson confiscate phones before, but something felt different this time. There was an edge to her voice, a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Please. Ashley tried again, her voice trembling slightly. My brother's in the hospital. I just need to check if he's... What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Mrs. Peterson's hand shot out, not waiting for Ashley to hand over the phone. Her fingers clamped around the device, but Ashley's grip tightened instinctively, not wanting to lose her only connection to news about her brother. For a brief moment, they'd both held the phone. Then, with a force that surprised everyone in the room, Mrs. Peterson yanked it away. But she didn't stop there. In what appeared to be a moment of unchecked frustration, she raised the phone above Ashley's desk and brought it down hard against the wooden surface. The crack of the phone hitting the desk sounded like a gunshot in the silent classroom. The screen shattered instantly, pieces of glass spraying across the surface. The phone's frame bent at an awkward angle, clearly broken beyond repair. The entire class gasped. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Another student quickly pulled out their phone, recording what was happening. Ashley stared at her destroyed phone in disbelief. All those important messages, pictures with her family, and most importantly, her connection to knowing if her brother was okay, all gone in an instant of senseless destruction.